Somewhere in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution, far from the galleries where crowds photograph the Spirit of St. Louis and the Apollo 11 command module, there is an object that resembles a cataloging error. It is partially deflated now, its rubber surfaces cracked by decades of storage, its wings drooping like those of a wounded bird. Were it not for the small placard identifying it, one might mistake it for the remains of some grotesquely oversized children's toy. But this object flew. It flew with a pilot aboard, propelled by a 40-horsepower engine at speeds of 60 miles per hour. This is the Goodyear Inflatoplane, the aircraft that fit in a suitcase, the airplane that the United States Army believed could rescue pilots shot down behind enemy lines. The inflatable plane that almost worked. The idea of building a rubber airplane did not originate in Goodyear's laboratories. It was born in a Brazilian jungle after the First World War, when an American inventor named Taylor McDaniel witnessed the death of his friend and business partner in an aircraft accident. The impact had shattered the wooden and fabric fuselage, turning the cockpit into a death trap of splinters and fragments. McDaniel became obsessed with a simple question. What if an airplane could bounce instead of disintegrate? Back in the United States, McDaniel spent years developing his concept. On the 4th of January, 1931, in a field near Washington, his glider made of inflatable rubber tubes completed its first flights. The pilot was Joseph Bergling, an experienced aviator who had agreed to participate in what many considered madness. That day, Bergling flew the glider 6 times. 1 week later, before journalists and government officials, McDaniel ordered something extraordinary. He asked Bergling to deliberately crash the glider. Bergling took the craft to approximately 80 feet and aimed it at the ground in a dive. The right wing struck first, folding over itself. Then the nose impacted the earth. The glider bounced. It literally bounced, like a giant beach ball shaped like an airplane. Bergling walked away with a bruised heel and a twisted knee. The damage to the glider was a single broken wire, a 50-cent repair. McDaniel died in 1952 without seeing his vision become reality. The Great Depression had strangled funding for experimental projects, and no manufacturer wanted to risk money on rubber airplanes. But 4 years after his death, a company with exactly the right expertise decided to try. Goodyear Aircraft Company was not merely the company behind the famous blimps. During the Second World War, it had built under license more Corsair fighters for the Navy than the original manufacturer, Chance Vought, had produced. It manufactured most of the components for the Black Widow night fighter. It possessed decades of experience working with rubberized fabrics for its lighter-than-air craft. In 1956, the company combined all that knowledge to create something the United States Army desperately wanted. The context was the Cold War and the fresh memory of Korea. During that conflict, hundreds of American pilots had been shot down behind enemy lines. Many survived the initial crash, only to be captured or to die waiting for rescue that never came. Only 10% of aviators downed during the war were recovered by search and rescue teams. The Army wanted a solution that did not require risking helicopters and their crews in hostile territory. It wanted an aircraft that could be parachute-dropped near a downed pilot, inflated in minutes, and flown back to friendly territory by the very man who needed rescuing. Goodyear accepted the challenge and solved it with astonishing speed. The first prototype was designed and built in just 12 days. The key to success was a material the company had developed called AR-Mat. It was a composite of 2 layers of nylon fabric coated with rubber, connected to each other by thousands of nylon threads arranged perpendicularly, forming a structure similar to an I-beam when inflated. The result was a material with one of the best strength-to-weight ratios of any construction material available at the time, rigid enough to form wings and fuselage when containing pressurized air, yet capable of folding to occupy minimal volume when deflated. On the 28th of May, 1957, at Goodyear's facilities near Wingfoot Lake in Akron, Ohio, test pilot Richard Ohm took off in the first prototype for its first flight. It lasted approximately 5 minutes and confirmed what the engineers had hoped. The aircraft was stable, manageable, and surprisingly comfortable. Ohm described it as providing a cushy ride, noting that the unique construction dampened vibrations during ground taxiing. He compared the handling to that of a conventional glider, predictable and without unpleasant surprises. Subsequent models refined the concept. The two-seat observation variant added an enclosed cockpit and was used to experiment with different landing gear configurations. The single-seat rescue variant became the definitive version, with specifications that seemed drawn from science fiction. It measured 19 feet 7 inches long, with a wingspan of 22 feet. Empty, it weighed just 225 pounds. The complete aircraft, deflated and folded, fit into a container of 44 cubic feet, small enough to be transported in a jeep, a trailer, or dropped from an aircraft in flight. The deployment process was elegantly simple. The pilot extracted the package from its container and unrolled it like a tent. Using a hand pump, he inflated the aircraft to approximately half capacity, a process taking about 10 minutes. Then he hand-started the two-stroke 40-horsepower Nelson engine mounted above the wing in tractor configuration. The engine not only drove the propeller, but also powered a compressor that completed the inflation and maintained pressure throughout the flight. The required pressure was surprisingly low, just 8 pounds per square inch, less than an automobile tire. This characteristic was deliberate. The engine's compressor could compensate for small leaks caused by light weapons fire. In theory, the aircraft could take several hits from .30 caliber rounds and continue flying as long as the engine ran. The performance specifications were respectable for an aircraft of its size and purpose: a cruise speed of 60 miles per hour, a range of 390 miles on 20 gallons of fuel, an endurance of 6.5 hours, a service ceiling of 10,000 feet, a takeoff distance of just 250 feet on grass, a rate of climb of 550 feet per minute. The Army was impressed, and it ordered additional units for extensive evaluation. The two-seat version was designed to rescue not only the pilot, but also an additional passenger, or to serve on observation missions with a dedicated observer. It was 2 inches shorter, but had nearly 6 more feet of wingspan. Its 60-horsepower McCulloch engine could lift 740 pounds to a maximum speed of 70 miles per hour, though with a reduced range of 275 miles. The program seemed destined for success. Newspapers speculated about a future where inflatable aircraft would be available to the general public, the perfect kit for vacationers, hunters, and hobbyists. An airplane small enough to store in the family station wagon. Goodyear even developed versions with interchangeable landing gear that could operate from land, water, or snow without modification. The future of personal aviation seemed to be made of rubber. Then came the accidents. In April of 1959, Richard Ohm, the same pilot who had made the prototype's first flight, was conducting tests over the Patuxent River in Maryland. During a maneuver, he pulled back on the stick too abruptly. The wing folded upward and struck the propeller, which shredded it. The aircraft deflated instantly, becoming a mass of rubber in freefall. Ohm managed to jump and deploy his parachute, landing in the water without serious injury. he was fortunate. 2 months later, Army Lieutenant Malcolm Wallace, 26 years old, from Greenville, Texas, was not so lucky. Wallace was completing the final 35 minutes of a mandatory training flight at Wingfoot Lake when something went terribly wrong. One of the control cables beneath the wing came off its pulley and became wedged in the bracket, locking the control stick. The aircraft began a descending turn that tightened with each revolution. At approximately 700 feet, the load on the outer wing exceeded the structural capacity of the inflated fabric. The wing folded over the propeller, which cut it to pieces. With the wings flapping from pressure loss, one of the aluminum wingtip skids struck Wallace in the head. The marks were imprinted on his helmet. He was pitched over the nose of the aircraft and fell into the shallow lake. His parachute never opened. Investigators concluded he was probably knocked unconscious by the skid impact before he could activate it. The outcome was tragic. The Navy lost interest immediately. The Army continued testing with renewed caution, but the doubts that had always existed about the concept became impossible to ignore. The fundamental problem was not that the inflatoplane did not work. It worked. It flew well, was easy to handle, and met its design specifications. The problem was that the mission for which it had been designed made no sense when examined closely. Consider the scenario. A supersonic jet pilot is shot down over enemy territory. He survives the ejection and parachute landing. Now he must evade enemy patrols while locating the container with his rescue aircraft, which ideally would have been dropped near his position. He must find a clearing of at least 250 feet for takeoff, a considerable distance in any forested or mountainous terrain. He must inflate the aircraft, a process taking 5 to 10 minutes, during which he is completely vulnerable. Then he must fly back through the same airspace where he was just shot down, now at 60 miles per hour, at a maximum altitude of 10,000 feet, in an airplane made of rubber that any firearm could damage. An Army general summarized the problem with brutal frankness. What good was a plane that could be brought down by a well-aimed bow and arrow? The claim was a technical exaggeration, but it captured the essence of the dilemma. The inflatoplane was too slow, too vulnerable, and too dependent on ideal conditions that would rarely exist in actual combat situations. Meanwhile, helicopters were improving rapidly. They could fly farther, faster, and recover pilots without requiring those pilots to become their own rescue teams. A helicopter with trained crew could locate a survivor, land in confined spaces, provide covering fire if necessary, and extract the pilot in minutes. The inflatoplane, however ingenious, could not compete with that capability. The war in Vietnam sealed the fate of the concept. The dense jungles of Southeast Asia offered none of the open spaces of 250 feet needed for takeoff. The idea that a phantom pilot shot down over hostile territory could escape by flying a rubber airplane at low speed over Viet Cong-controlled jungle was, at best, fantastical. In total, Goodyear built 12 inflatoplanes. Development continued until 1972, more from bureaucratic inertia than real hope of military adoption. The project was officially canceled in 1973, 17 years after its conception, without a single aircraft having been used in an operational mission. Of the 12 built, only 3 survive today. One sits in storage at the Smithsonian, its rubber surfaces slowly deteriorating in climate-controlled darkness. Another remains at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. The third, the only one currently on public display, can be seen at the Stonehenge Air Museum in Fort Teen, Montana. The airmat material, however, found a second life. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration continued developing the technology for advanced aerospace applications, including inflatable re-entry shields and deployable wings for orbital vehicles that could transform into gliders when entering the thin atmospheres of planets like Mars. The idea of inflatable aerospace structures, born in Taylor McDaniel's dreams and refined in Goodyear's hangars, turned out to have a future after all, just not in the form anyone had imagined. There is something deeply American about the inflatoplane, something that captures both the audacity and the ingenuity of mid-20th century technical imagination. It was an elegant solution to a real problem, executed with genuine competence by engineers who knew exactly what they were doing. It worked. That is the detail that makes it more than a historical curiosity. It did not fail because it was impossible. It failed because the world for which it was designed did not exist. Downed pilots in enemy territory needed rescue, but they did not need to become pilots of rubber airplanes. Military technology advanced in directions that made the concept obsolete before it could prove its value. The helicopter, not the inflatable aircraft, became the symbol of combat rescue. Taylor McDaniel died believing that inflatable airplanes were the future. In a certain sense, he was right. He was only wrong about which future, and for whom. His conceptual descendants will not carry pilots home from hostile jungles. They will carry scientific instruments through alien atmospheres, deploying wings of a fabric and air on worlds where no human being has ever walked. In the Montana Museum, the last publicly displayed inflatoplane remains inflated, its wings extended as if awaiting a takeoff order that will never come. Visitors pass before it, some pausing to read the explanatory placard, most continuing toward more conventional exhibits. Few realize they are looking at the dream of a man who wanted airplanes to bounce instead of shatter, transformed by a corporation that believed it could package salvation in a box smaller than a refrigerator. They built an airplane that fit in a suitcase. It flew. And that, regardless of everything else, remains extraordinary.